So, good morning, people of God. Welcome back to the fourth and last installment of our sermon series for such a time as this. Thank you so much for sticking with me in all these weeks as we've been talking about God's mission and how we participate in God's mission as we make our way to our celebration weekend just a week away now. So we've talked about how this is not our mission. It's not something I make up. It's not something you make up. It's not something the church council votes on. It's God's mission. And that mission is to connect and reconnect and reconcile and redeem all of creation. And we've talked about how God's mission starts with us at home, maybe around the kitchen table as we are gathered and we grow up and we hear the stories of faith and we get our identity. And then how that moves to the altar table right here, where we gather and we are fed, so that then we can go out and be about that mission of God to heal a broken world. See, mission is always outward oriented. We talked about a lot about that last week. It's never about ourselves. It never looks inward. It's always outward, both locally, right, across the street, but then also across the whole world. God's mission is to heal a broken world. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today in this last installment of the series. And in order to help me with that, I've brought a friend along. I want you to meet Benny. Benny is my big purple BHAG. You know what a BHAG is? Anybody? A BHAG, B-H-A-G, it stands for a big, hairy, audacious goal. BHAG. Actually comes out of the corporate world. It comes out of a book called Built to Last, Successful Habits of Visionary Companies that was published in 1994. It's by James Collins and Jerry Porras. And those two argued that in the corporate world, for companies, to have a future and to move forward and to get more market share and all that kind of good stuff, they needed a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal, something that drives them, a mission that's almost unattainable. That's how big it is. And that's why Benny, I got him when I was serving in Maryland as the bishop there, one of the youth groups there gave it to me. He reminds me that fixing a broken world is just a really, really big undertaking. It's not a small thing. It's a huge vision. It's a BHAG. And so Benny sits on my bookshelf in my office and he looks down on me, and every once in a while I look up and I remember that doing God's mission in the world with our hands is a huge thing, and not always easy, and not always successful, but always faithful and driven by God's love. It takes commitment. It takes persistence. Kind of persistence like this widow shows in today's gospel story, right? Here she is, and she keeps coming back to the church, and she keeps badgering him again and again. She's being persistent. Here is what Stephen Bowman, the author of the book, The Mission Table, says about that. Here's a quote. In Luke 18, Jesus tells a parable about the need to pray always and not lose heart. This story illustrates Jesus' preference for outrageous action. I like that. Preference for outrageous action and the assertion of dignity, pride, and holy impatience. An annoying widow pesters an unjust judge until he gives her what she wants. Steve Bowman is going to be with us one more time this Wednesday night on Zoom, and I hope you can join us as we dig a little deeper into this. But for right now, let me just say that this widow is the very picture of powerlessness. This widow has no voice. This widow has no status. This widow is poor. In the society of Jesus, women were always dependent on a man. Either it was your father or it was your husband or maybe an uncle sometimes or some kind of a sponsor. But women on their own couldn't actually even live. They didn't have a place. They didn't own anything. They couldn't survive. And so the Bible often talks about the widows and the orphans, right? Who in that society were totally powerless and voiceless. And it's precisely this powerless person who comes. I mean, this widow may be voiceless, but she won't shut up. She has what Steve Bowman just called a holy impatience. I like that term. A holy impatience, a persistence. And it strikes me that's what we need to address the problems and the challenges in this broken world. I have to spend a whole lot of time to convince you that the world is broken. I mean, all you have to do is look around you, right? It starts with our own personal lives. There's lots of brokenness there. There's divorce, there's addiction, there's domestic violence, there is abuse, there is illness, you name it. And then in our communities, in our world, we are going through a pandemic right now. There's more poverty. There's more hunger. There is institutional racism. There is white supremacy. There is war in many different places around the world. The world is broken. And the question for us today is, what is the role of the church? What is the role of religion in this context to address that broken world? Well, if you look at the word religion itself, I always like to do a little word study, right? And look at the etymology. Religion comes from the Latin religare, and the little prefix re always means again or back, like in many, many words that we have, right? And then ligare literally means to tie, to fasten, to connect, to unite. Think of our word ligament that we get from that. Ligament is something that connects the muscles to the bones and the tissues to other parts of our bodies. So religion, religare, literally means to reconnect. To reconnect us with God, but then also to reconnect us with one another. So there's a vertical dimension, God and me, and there's a horizontal dimension, me and everybody else around me. Well, see, unfortunately, in our culture, religion is too often seen as a kind of a private, me and my God kind of a thing that doesn't have any bearing on the broken world other than to exist on a private, holier-than-thou morality. Too often we think that, it's between me and my God and it's nobody's business and religion is a private thing and I shouldn't even talk about it, lest I offend someone who doesn't believe as I do. Well, I'm not one who's going to tell you that you should go and proselytize people and hit them over the head with the Bible. That's not what I'm talking about. But God does call us to be public about our faith, to talk about Jesus, to let people know what it is that drives us to do good in this world. Here's Bowman and what Stephen Bowman has to say about that. We have seen too many ways that religion shows up in the public arena only around issues of private morality, seeking public clout for a variety of issues. These issues often divide red states and blue states church members and citizens. Well, do we need to? All they have to do is look at the election season right now. We can't even talk to each other anymore. And then Bowman says, but how do we leave the defended spaces of morality battles and find one another at the point of the widow's cry for justice? The God of the Bible, Stephen says, is about the poor, the stranger, the last, the least, the most vulnerable. So that quote from Stephen Bowman begins to answer this question: what is the church's role in our larger community beyond the church doors, where Church Street and Main Street intersect? Here's a way to look at this that comes out of Bowman's book. It begins, if you look at this little picture on the lower left-hand corner, with individual acts of mercy. It begins with me. It begins with you as an individual disciple, follower of Jesus. It begins with all that we do in our own lives in giving witness to our faith, both verbally, by talking about it, but then also with our hands, by volunteering at the food pantry, by giving money to worthy causes, by giving blood to the Red Cross. I mean, there's a million ways. And Christ the King is a congregation that does that in so many ways. So many of you are not the kind of Christians who just shows up for an hour on Sunday morning, well, now in front of the TV, right? But you do so many things all week long, these individual acts of mercy. That's where it begins. And then the next step, as you go around this little circle there, is direct services. And again, the church has a long history of being involved in that. We were one of the congregations 51 years ago that helped to start Dorcas Ministries, right? That's a direct service, nonprofit provider that helps to feed people and house them and counsel them and all that. And that's only one of a dozen examples of how we are involved as CTK out in the larger community. Then the next step around the circle would be economic development and sustainability, where you kind of go the next step and you do a more intense way of serving folks. The best example I have for that comes from my past when I was serving in Camden, New Jersey, the poorest city in the country, where there was literally not enough housing for folks. And the little housing there was, people couldn't afford. We started a housing corporation, a nonprofit. We called it the Camden Lutheran Housing Corporation. And we ended up, for the first time in decades, to build actual new housing in that part of the city. It was a big deal. That was 40 years ago now, and they are still at it. The Camden Lutheran Housing Corporation is active to this day, building affordable housing in a very poor neighborhood. That's an example of economic development and sustainability. Advocacy, the next step, we know something about. We have a very active advocacy team, we call it the A-team, that is helping us as a local church to think about how we can be involved, trying to influence public policy so that people wouldn't be hungry in the first place, right? See, this is where advocacy is really important. We are called to feed hungry people. Of course we are, and we do, and we should. But we should also ask the question, why are people hungry in the first place? And if they had a decent job and could feed themselves, wouldn't that be better? So to advocate for education, for jobs, for affordable housing, for the things that people need to help themselves, that's what advocacy is all about. And we are very active in that as well now. And then the final thing there on Bowman's circle is grassroots organizing and mobilization. And here our best example is One Way, a new grassroots, nonpartisan, multiracial, multi-faith coalition of now 42 churches, us included. There's a couple synagogues, there's a couple mosques as well. We represent together probably more than 50,000 residents of Wake County. And this Tuesday coming up on the 13th, One Wake is going to have its founding assembly. We've been announcing this. As of right now, we have 94 people from CTK signed up. It's not too late. I hope you'll still show up. I talked a lot about that last week. So if you haven't yet, make sure you come, because that is an example of grassroots organizing and mobilization. So as you can see, Christ the King, in one way or another, is involved in all of those, but it begins with individual acts of kindness and mercy. It begins with you and with me and how we live our lives. Here again is Stephen Bowman. Today, people who claim to follow Jesus and to live by the guidance of Holy Scripture allow ourselves to be divided over private morality, while millions in our country and the world barely survive the scandal of poverty and hunger. The scandal of poverty and hunger. And then Steve Bowman cites Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1967 wrote an important book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? A book that's never gone out of being relevant, but today is even more relevant than it ever has been. Because in that book, Dr. King compares poverty to cannibalism, of all things. And he says, cannibalism in a pre-civilization was a sign of what that society's values were, which were very high. And in the same way, hunger is a totally uncivilized way, and poverty, of being a society. And then Dr. King says in that book, the time has come for us to civilize ourselves by the total, direct, and immediate abolition of poverty. 1967. And of course, with the coronavirus, we are seeing an increase in hunger and poverty, both locally and in the world even now. The pandemic is really redefining what church is and how we do church. It's brought so many, many changes. And we need to approach this tremendous shift with persistence, like the widow. We need to approach this tremendous shift with holy impatience and with a sense that it is God's mission of redemption and reconciliation that the world needs now more than ever. Because it's true. We are doing God's work. We're doing God's work with our hands, and without God, all of our efforts will be in vain. And that big, hairy, audacious goal will remain just that, a goal, unrealistic, unattainable, far off, a dream unfulfilled. Without God, we are lost. But with God, all things are possible. All things are possible with God, even attaining our BHAG, our big, hairy, audacious goal. The youth group back in Maryland who gave me my little friend here, my Benny, they understood what I'm talking about because they redefined BHAG. And they came up with a different way to look at that acronym. Look at the back of his T-shirt, and what does it say there? It says that this is a big, holy, awesome God. A big, holy, awesome God. And with that big, holy, awesome God, we can make a difference in the world. We can eliminate poverty. We can bring a little piece of God's kingdom into this world. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the good news for you this morning. And to that, let the people of God say, Amen. Amen.